Hello and welcome back to another quick live stream with myself, Jonathan from Emotive. And I wanted to take a few minutes just to spend some time with you today, as promised, with these regular live streams. And what I would be like to talk to you about is mobile design. So, some people have asked me over the years how much experience I have with mobile design. Well, my experience is extended from the initial days of app creation in terms of when they became a thing, all the way through to the modern day in terms of how they've evolved with larger screens and the more complex technologies that sit inside the devices. But just to be clear, there are two kind of levels of app development. There is software tools or software language that will basically create apps across multiple platforms, meaning it will, through one code base, allow you to create applications for both Android and iOS within one code base. And there's a lot of benefits to that, from easy to kind of maintain through a single source code, and easy to kind of keep coherency between the two. But there's also some negatives. Performance was one of them. Sometimes not being able to tap into certain hardware and features and functions that the devices have, or the lack of parity between the two. And so that creates very generic types of apps. And although that it can be fine, those apps can be quite uninspiring in terms of how they work. They tend to be a bit more rudimentary in terms of their UI, their repeatability, their kind of general look and feel, and the way that the user interacts with them, because they have to take into account both how you interact with an iOS device versus how you might interact with an Android device, and then the scalability across those different device ranges. So that is one end of the spectrum, and tends to work well for large corporations. But the other end of the scale, although it can be more expensive to have a bespoke team look after each side, is to actually build native code apps. So actually building with things like Swift or Objective-C, or the different languages that sit on the Android side of things. The benefits of that is you build a much more performant application, and an application that will work better for users who want to kind of tap into the hardware that's actually, so if you want to tap into things like gyroscopes or the Touch ID or Face ID and use those for different functionality, it tends to work much better if you use the native code, and builds much better in terms of animations and performance. So you'll tend to see the consideration around the UX and UI of that tend to be a little bit more imaginative, a little bit more creative, because it will leverage the animation tools and the hardware and different things that are inside the device, especially once you start to get down to the deeper code levels, where you might be tapping into things like core data, core animation, core image, things like that iOS, for example, offers. In terms of Android side of stuff, they have similar code core functionality, but because they've always grown up as a web-based tool through the Linux platform, they've always lent more to that kind of technology stack in terms of what they offer. So it's always lent itself better to the cross-platform side of things. In terms of the history of myself, let's just go back to that for a second. I got into apps and app design. I mean, obviously, I'm not talking about pre-iPhone days where we were doing stuff around Palm Pilots and things like that. Those existed, and I have experience with those. But really talking about the kind of the inflection point where iOS introduced apps and everybody else started to go, right, that's also the solution. So I remember really being at that apex point where you're creating apps that kind of really push the platform from a native perspective. Pretty much native was the way to go at that point. And also, how do you transform existing web projects or projects that didn't even exist into a mobile experience? Understanding what those tap sizes should be, understanding how to kind of navigate without the hover state, for example. It sounds obvious today, but at the time, it's that translation from what you would have from a desktop experience wasn't necessarily the easiest to translate because we had things like hover, we had things like right click, we had things like drag. These things were already in the desktop paradigm and had to be reinvented or re-understood from a mobile perspective. So, what should those touch targets should be? What happens when you hold and press versus what you do when you tap and press? How do you prevent things like collisions or interactive points that shouldn't be happening when you're scrolling, and different things along those lines? So that was something that we really helped define. So what you define as modern UX, modern UI, modern product today was very much something that myself and other people at the time were thought leaders of pushing those boundaries and understanding, so, this has gone too far, it's complicated, and coming up with new paradigms that even Apple and other companies would not put forward. The pull to refresh and how that would work. It would very much didn't exist. It was a button at the top right, you refreshed. And they realized that there was a kind of championing of removing the UI, becoming more simplistic, becoming in some ways a bit more rudimentary because there was less going on in the screen. There was less functionality, there's less buttons, but through gesture control, that became far more prevalent, and it became the paradigms. Things like swipe to unlock wasn't there at day one. That came a little bit later. Things like pull to refresh, as I say, to scroll, pinch to zoom, tap to zoom. All of these things became kind of defined through those processes so that we have them as standard paradigms today. And even things like carousels and things were kind of new. They did exist on web, but not to the same extent. So to move forward with those things was a really inspiring and interesting way to push those boundaries, to the point where today we have a well-known trodden path of what works, what doesn't work, what are good paradigms, what are bad paradigms. My concern, I would say, today is we've lent so deeply into design systems, and don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to bash design systems, they're massively important. We've lost the human psychology part of why things are laid out in the page the way they should be or are, what objectives they're trying to hit, and those user journeys and behavioral journeys, both from a interaction leading point of view to the onward journey through the app or the website. I think that's a bit of a concern that I'm seeing. We've lost that experimental behavior. I've seen a couple of conversations here on LinkedIn and elsewhere where I've pointed out, so look, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, X, all of these kind of different video platforms all have the same interface, the same paradigm, the same UI elements. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's some benefits to jumping between one to the other in terms of a system experience and being able what to do almost straight away because everything's similar. But it gets rid of the creativity, it gets rid of the personality, it gets rid of the uniqueness of what that app is trying to do. Why, and to the broader point, why should I use YouTube over TikTok? Why should I use Reels over Facebook or Shorts? You're removing all of that when your UI and your experiences and the purpose of it does not lead you to create those differences. Then it's just one company. It's like, let's do it to all of them, and it becomes very generic and very uninspiring. And I would say that it does that on a UX UI level as well with some of the applications. So I'm not advocating going back to the Wild West, but I would like to see a little bit more experimentalism. I would like to see a bit more going back to the fundamentals of looking at human interaction, because I actually would challenge a lot of the UX paradigms right now. I don't think that usable from a user interface perspective. They are maybe common and they maybe reduce friction or work within an overarching kind of user journey, but I don't think necessarily they are that usable. There's possibly far too many buttons or tap to clicks, and we don't look at gestures anymore. We don't look at human behavior or predicting what users are going to do. So the logic's gone. It's all very tap click, and to go through. So what is my point really? I think mobiles have become, there was a pace, place not too long ago where mobiles in screen sizes and functionality were quite diverse, and so the apps needed to kind of support a wider range of devices than they used to. I think they're narrowing back down to within a certain screen size range now, so they're becoming a bit more common in terms of functionality, and we can be a bit more predictable. We're moving away from the baseline 300 pixels being the minimum need, all the way up to the larger screen sizes. I think we're moving that baseline up. And so when we do that and we say, okay, the average now is, let's say 640s, that is now the average. In width, you start to get this kind of, okay, well, we no longer have to make it work for such a small screen size. What can we do with this extra real estate, knowing that we've got higher, but this is our minimum? And I think that creates some exciting opportunities. Just to tap back on my other point, if we want UI and UX to be that common across every app, I think we actually create a behavioral confusion between what app am I in now, because it all looks the same. And the other side of it is, if commonality helps with the experience, then just use the native UX guidelines that both Apple and Google give you. Don't go halfway house and go, well, that's the new paradigm, because Google and Apple spent a lot of money and time and effort and thinking about what those should be. But even both of those promote heavily a sense of uniformity, but also individuality between their apps and between things like colors and indicators and things like that. So I would like to see you follow the guidelines or create an experience that is unique to your brand and to your objective of those users. I don't think the 5-button or the 5-icon bar at the bottom is a very good interface for a lot of functionality. It's quite restrictive. You have to put a lot within those 5 buttons, or those 5 buttons have to be, and you always end up with this kind of, oh, actually, I've got 6 functions, 7 functions. They kind of fall off the thing, and then end up in the dot menu or somewhere else, or jammed in the settings, which somewhere else, and it starts to create this like confusion for the user, saying, well, for me, for example, I might not want to post any kind of reels or anything. I'm just an observer of the platform. I'm not a creator. And then for the creators, they're like, well, all this observatory kind of functionality is in the way. So again, there's arguments to have pro modes. There's arguments to have different apps that potentially service different functionalities. I mean, I know YouTube offer YouTube Studio alongside the YouTube viewing app. But again, I think there's far too much overlap between those two things and usability. So I would say if you're an app designer or wanting to get into app designer, I would say go back to the core fundamentals. The core fundamentals are human behavior in terms of interaction, the device itself in terms of its limitations, both from a hardware functionality and from the screen real estate, and to really understand the situational awareness that those things will be used in. Is it within touch reach? Does tapping in and out of these menus, is that the right paradigm needed for somebody who's walking along the street trying to navigate or trying to get a quick answer or discount to a store or something fast, versus somebody who might be sitting on the train doom scrolling is a very different experience, or somebody who sits at home and has that ability to transition to a larger device, or sitting in bed watching a movie is completely different to somebody who's moving. So understanding situational awareness of where those devices will be used and the apps being used is really, really important. And that behavioral, and design systems aren't going to do that for you inherently. They will have the components and the functionality that you need to build out a screen and the design consistently and repeatedly from a brand aesthetics point of view, but you still need that psychology, behavioral, user flows, and understanding that situal positioning of where the user will be doing. Go back to those. Stop looking at Dribbble and everywhere else, or or just taking the design system and go, oh, somebody's already thought about it, so therefore I don't need to, and I'm just going to put these things on the page and hope for the best. I know people still do or companies are still doing user testing, but the user testing these days doesn't really seem to be looking at situational awareness or usability. It tends to be much more on a binary level of, does this work or does it not work? Is the customer happy with it? Are they not happy with it? And some of the answers will be inherently answered through that, but there is a lot of there's a lot of kind of false negative information that you're picking up from those user testings. The way I used to do it in the olden days was basically I would go out with the device myself and walk around and use it myself. So yes, we need quantitative data in terms of multiple users testing it to get those different situational awarenesses and making sure you still build things in to get that feedback. But using things like Hotjar to get the behavioral experience rather than just Google Analytics from an analytical insight, nothing's better than you taking the device out yourself and going out into the wild and going, wow, this is really irritating. And they call it eating your own dog food. And I don't think enough businesses and companies and creators do that, partly because they don't given the time, partly because they don't want to. But I think it would be extremely valuable to get out there and do that. So in terms of some of the apps that I've worked on mobile-wise, I've created a lot of the high street banking apps that you kind of use every day. I was one of the first people, with obviously a team of people, to transition them from online web banking and from a basic concept and then moving that into mobile. I've been involved with kind of marketing and experiment apps for companies like EMI for our music and entertainment. I've worked with a lot of kind of music brands and stuff like that. I've worked along Sky, a lot of the kind of now Sky TV, now Sky Go apps that you experience, plus the set-top boxes and web experiences. But those mobile apps I've been involved with. I've worked in retail in terms of creating apps that are for loyalty, reward, ordering, those sort of things, or as you kind of go in and out of different locations, having the apps kind of transpose or transform to be different from in a location versus everyday use, or whether you've kind of moved up through tiers. So, for example, you become a premium user. How does the app unlock or present different things through retail experiences? So I was involved, for example, with a lot of the retail experiences that happen within Apple from both a user's perspective, but also from the staffing perspective. So the training materials, how they serve customers through both iPad and iPhone, how we got rid of the concept of a till. That was a piece of work that we kind of did. And then from a customer's perspective, if you aren't aware, you can buy a certain range of products within the Apple store directly from your phone and don't even need to engage with a staff member. You can just go in, scan, pay, and walk out. So those concepts didn't exist and became a cornerstone of solving very key needs for Apple. And they were widely adopted across multiple retail sites. I would say some of them poorly adopted and some of them adopted really well. But that was something that was a kind of a bit of a game changer. I've worked in the automotive space as well. So both creating things like in-car experiences, configurators, but also from a servicing point of view. If you're an Audi user, you'll know that you'll be able to receive videos of your service and what was changed, what was not, and what they're advising you to change, and how you can kind of order that through the app or through the web to have the tires changed without having to come back in or call up. You can just approve it. And then booking, searching, and then controlling your car within that. We actually worked with people at Ferrari and Aston Martin to create experiences directly in the car through the infotainment system. So if you're in a track, it changed the app actually unlocked and said, okay, you're in a safe location, you're in a known track, and it would actually give you things like G meters and different things, and record in live video your experience if that was on the dashboard. So different things like that create that creativity between situational awareness of how those apps should behave. There's been different other experiences around banking and payment sharing along those kind of lines. So there's been things like training tools as well. So I've worked on stuff around AI and Gen AI in terms of how to create new ways of learning. So this is something I'm kind of passionate about. Having dyslexia myself and being somebody that kind of struggled through the educational system, and my observation of it wasn't that my intelligence was any less. It was, you're asking somebody to prove their intelligence on a system that isn't necessarily geared best to the way that person works and thinks. So despite it being I know those educational purists like to say, well, it's a benchmark and everybody's evenly measured against it. I would argue that isn't the best format, because it's kind of geared and rigged towards the academically strong. And if you're not academically strong because you suffer from reading and writing and issues around potentially numbers or whole range of issues that come around with neurodivergence, you're immediately classified as less, and you actually might not be. You may have understood the subject matter much better than somebody who's more academically rigid, but you've understood it in a holistic or three-dimensional sense. So to measure, I think the understanding of the subject is far more important than the rigid kind of academia method that's that. So this is something where I think AI could be really interesting in terms of understanding how you best learn. So if you're more of a visual learner, it might provide you the content in more audio and video sense, or if you're somebody that works better with written word, or somebody who works better in pictures, or somebody who works better in interaction and diagrams and kind of experiments directly. These things that AI could kind of drip feed with you, and I think progressional understanding of a subject is far more valuable than a end state test, which is a bit of a lottery. It's a bit of a 50-50 kind of chance. If you're poorly on the day, or the questions are written in a way that confuses you, you may not get it through. And it also kind of breeds this idea of training people to pass the test rather than understand the subject. So if you're progressively always being tested, like AI can then either move you forward when it thinks you've understood the subject based on your answers and based on the way you're interacting, either faster or slower, or it can actually loop you back to some of the core fundamentals. So I have a young daughter who struggles with of the comprehensive stuff in the English, and she struggles with some of the pattern and angle side of things, even though she's very strong at mathematics overall and English overall, those kind of 2 points. So she can be progressed fast in one part of the subject, but then re-looping until the AI feels it understands that she's understood those elements better, and then kind of pushing up the complexity a little bit, and then until she kind of proves again that she's understood it, and then moves it forward. So I think that kind of progressive, hyper-tailored educational system will come in. I'm not suggesting this is a replacement for teachers. I think it's a supplement. So the teachers, I think, should be moving more into the practical and the engagement level, making schools becoming more of a destination to engage functionally, physically, and then using AI as a mobile platform for continuous learning to supplement that experience. So whether you're at home, on the bus, or directly in school, I think that as a supplemental learning, I think combined could be really, really strong and actually progress people much faster than they are through the current curriculums. Anyway, so I've worked on logic like that for Gen AI experiences, where it can create things in real time, and each thing is uniquely formatted to you as it learns as you study, and learns you and you learn it, sort of thing. So I think that's progressively really exciting. I've worked on things to help with dyslexia. I've worked with different mobile apps that work across multiple sectors. So it doesn't really matter what we're talking about. The same principles apply in every one of those sectors, whether it's banking, automotive, retail, education, healthcare, or whatever. I've done really interesting stuff around hearing aids, by the way, as well. So the key points are, going back to my point, is really to understand the use case of what the user is going to be doing with the application or using the app, and where they might be situated. Building the UI that best suits that for easy use and comfort use, so that it's actually fun, engaging, doesn't create frictions. You're not jumping in and out menus and things that make you kind of stop. All right, I've got to look, and what am I doing? Where am I going? You want to make it simple. So this is where I actually say something like buttons and different things may not work, and you may actually want to make the entire screen the interaction, because it works a lot better to tap an entire screen. So, for example, if you're creating an audio player, which may be on the move or in a car, you probably don't want little buttons that say skip, forward, but you probably want something that's like the entire screen's taken over and it's more gestural. So tap the entire screen to stop and play, swipe or left or right to move forward 30 seconds, whatever. Use the entire or a large element in the screen to do that. It's probably better to stop you from having to look down, figure out how to get your finger on the screen as you're driving, and which is a distraction and a danger, or even if you're walking along. So how do you do that to make those kind of experiences function better? And you can have multiple modes within an app as well. Making sure that when you detect low lateral movements within the gyroscope, that it kind of goes back to more on a normal state. Or if it detects that you've been plugged into CarPlay and you're moving, give the larger screen. So these are sort of experience. Make sure you understand the user situational awareness is kind of first and foremost. Leverage design systems and UI patterns and things like that to the extent, but don't just leverage them from a it's done, right? You really need to still revisit that situation and its user behavior within it. And if you have to build a new component to do that, build a new component to do that. Don't just go, this is pretty, here's tiles, we're working with tiles and buttons and text, and everything's a 16 to whatever font, and therefore it's inherently perfect. It's not. So those things are going to be really kind of key to understanding. So make sure you leverage your UX, all the disciplines within UX, make sure that you're doing that. And for you UI guys, it sounds like I'm giving you a hard time. I'm not. You've been doing a really, really good job, and you still do what you do, and you rock that space. But it has to come back to a bit more of a balance between UX and UI, rather than where I feel we've pivoted too heavily to UI straight to development. I think even UI is not allowed to experiment as much as it was. There's less creativity happening around that. We're less looking at what shape and format and coloring can help with affordances. It's kind of just assumed, using shadow and using mute states and different things like that is defined, and it's a done deal. We don't have to do any more thinking, and everything's become systematic. So I think even from a design perspective, a UI design perspective, there's still a lot you can do around how can we make this better? How can we deal with more interaction, animation, affordances? How can we really tell the users around that three-dimensional state of what's happening? So if the UX is focusing on the behavior, from a UI perspective, I'd like to see a lot more clarity around the use of text, spacing, imagery, making sure that it's clear what the interactions are. One of the things we did at HSBC, which was really clear, is, and you may find it, they've broken these rules from time to time, but the general rule we had is we only wanted one red CTA in the page. There could be a tertiary or secondary CTA, there could be a green CTA, there could be different colors, but the one red CTA was your most important CTA. And through that, you knew that was the next step to progress to a form or to the most important information or progress. So even if you didn't read the page, look for the red CTA, you can move forward. And so having those kind of logic through what you create visually is really, really important, to have that kind of breadcrumb trace to reduce the cognitive load on the user of what's happening is really, really important. So again, if I was going to criticize the menu bar at the bottom, what is the one action? You've given me 5 actions. And we've always said, like, from a pyramid of information, of a hierarchy that you need to inform the user. What is the number one thing they should be doing? And then you broaden out that pyramid from there. So what is the next two things that they should be doing, the next three things, four things, and then the information gets wider in terms of your informational hierarchy. So again, through navigation, if I'm looking at the 5 buttons below, you've basically said to me they're all equal. And that is impossible. They're not all equal. There is a motivation and a direction that the app is clearly designed for, first and foremost, that the company first and foremost wants you to do. So highlight it, make it a different color, make it larger, make it more focused, so that becomes the primary tap. And the other two may be the quick number 2 and 3 in terms of actions, but having everything equal basically makes the user go, and then they basically it becomes a bit of a choice paralysis. So they default to the home, the reels or the home screen or whatever. So going back to that again, situational awareness, understand what the application is supposed to be used for, driving users clearly with that, making sure you've got that hierarchy of content clearly defined. We're predominantly a posts company, and reels and feeds a second, or we're predominantly about connecting people, and everything else is second and third. So get that focus is really important. The same thing as if you're doing anything in retail or anything like that. If I'm walking around a shop, I don't want to be doing this. I want to be looking at the goods and the offers. So how does my phone help me? Yes, scanning things in, great. But I've noticed that the buttons and stuff, and it's easy to tap and miss scan and things. So how can we make that a bit easier to work if you're Sainsbury's and Tesco's, for example? So that's coming to the end of this short conversation. I spent 30 minutes, but I really like to go back to the basics. One, to highlight the fact that I've worked on tons of mobile before UX and design was a label. It was just called design, and we had the right methods within companies like Apple and that exploratory point of understanding user behavior that defined the world that you understand today. And I would say just take a moment to go back to some of those core principles before you move forward with your existing work. And if you have an existing design system, leverage it, but see how you need to improve it and move things forward. Thanks for now.